The year is 1575, and a shroud of silence has fallen over the vibrant port of Palermo. The usual cacophony of the market, the shouts of fishermen, the laughter of children, all have been swallowed by a deeper, more terrifying sound, the constant low murmur of prayer and the sporadic hacking cough that echoes from behind bolted doors. A deadly plague, a familiar and dreaded specter, has descended upon the city. It is merciless, moving through the crowded, sun-baked streets with an invisible, unstoppable force. In mere weeks, it claims tens of thousands, turning bustling piazzas into open-air tombs and filling the air with the suffocating smell of death and disinfectant. But in the midst of this unimaginable horror, a single story of resilience begins, unnoticed by the world. There is a boy. His name is Giovanni Filippo. Like so many others, he feels the fever, the weakness, the terrifying appearance of the dreaded buboes that mark a person for death. He watches as neighbors, friends, and loved ones are taken, their bodies hauled away on carts in the dead of night. He endures the agony, waiting for the end to come. Yet, against all odds and reason, he survives. He lives. And in that singular, miraculous event, a seed is planted. A seed that would one day grow to change the very course of medicine forever. This is not just the story of a plague. This is the story of that boy, Giovanni Filippo in Gracia. It is the story of how a childhood forged in the crucible of a pandemic, a first-hand encounter with the worst death humanity could offer, ignited a fierce and brilliant mind. It is the story of how a survivor of the plague would dedicate his entire life to understanding it, fighting it, and ultimately, building the very foundations of public health that would protect generations to come. This is the story of how one boy's brush with death led him to a lifelong war against it. The outbreak that arrived in 1575 was a later, virulent wave of the same bubonic plague that had decimated Europe centuries earlier as the Black Death. It was a ghost from a terrifying past, returning with a familiar, brutal efficiency. The disease moved with a swiftness that stripped away all vestiges of civilization. It began subtly, a fever, a chill, a general malaise that could be mistaken for a common illness. But then came the telltale signs, the marks that sealed a person's fate, the buboes. These were swollen, inflamed lymph nodes, most often found in the groin, armpits, or neck, swelling to the size of an apple and turning a sinister, dark purple-black. They were excruciatingly painful, a physical manifestation of the poison within. Accompanying them were purple blotches on the skin, caused by subcutaneous bleeding, which only added to the disease's grim nickname. The progression was horrifyingly fast. A person could be seemingly healthy at dawn and be buried by dusk. There was no cure, only a desperate, painful wait for a death that came for nearly 2/3 of those it touched. The plague's impact, however, extended far beyond the physical suffering of its victims. It unraveled the very fabric of society. As death tolls soared, the city descended into chaos. Trade, the lifeblood of a port like Palermo, ground to a halt. Markets were shuttered, and the bustling docks fell silent, quarantined by fear. The streets, once vibrant with life, now echoed with the solemn chants of priests leading funeral processions, or the grim calls of the Menotti, the body collectors, who navigated the city with their carts, their faces often hidden, their work macabre and thankless. Authorities, powerless against the disease, resorted to desperate measures. Houses where the plague was found were boarded up, condemning the sick and the healthy inside to their fate together. Families were torn apart, with the healthy often abandoning the sick out of sheer primal terror. The air was thick with the smoke of burning tar and sulfur, believed to purify the air, and the stench of death was inescapable. It was a world where hope was a scarce commodity, and the only certainty was the daily tally of the dead. It was into this world of collapsing certainty that the young Giovanni Filippo in Gracia was born. His childhood in Palermo was not one of unusual privilege or remarkable poverty, but rather a typical life for a boy of his time, likely filled with the simple routines of family, study, and the vibrant, if sometimes rough, culture of a Sicilian city. All of that was shattered the moment the plague took root. The familiar streets of his neighborhood became a landscape of fear. The sounds of play were replaced by the sounds of mourning. He would have witnessed the gradual disappearance of his friends, the fearful whispers of adults, and the constant looming presence of the unknown. The epidemic was no longer a distant story or a historical tale. It was a palpable force that stole the world he knew, replacing it with one governed by isolation, superstition, and the ever-present specter of loss. The emotional core of his experience was this profound disruption: the loss of safety, the loss of community, and the chilling realization of his own mortality. Then, the inevitable, dreaded event occurred. Giovanni fell ill. The first feverish sweat, the creeping weakness that made his limbs feel heavy as stone, and finally, the appearance of the swollen, tender lumps that confirmed the worst. For a boy his age, this was a death sentence. The agony was not just physical, though the pain of the buboes was said to be unbearable. It was the psychological torment of knowing what was to come. For his family, the despair was absolute. To watch a child succumb to this horror, to be powerless to stop it, to face the grim ritual of preparing for another loss, this was the true depth of the plague's cruelty. They would have cared for him as best they could, likely with prayers and poultices, all the while steeling themselves for the inevitable outcome, waiting for the moment his young life would be extinguished like so many others. But that moment never came. In a twist of fate that defied all statistical probability and contemporary medical understanding, Giovanni Filippo Ingrassia did not die. The fever broke. The painful swellings receded. Slowly, unbelievably, he regained his strength. He had faced the worst the biological world could throw at him and had emerged on the other side. He was a survivor, one of the precious few. His body now carried not just the memory of the illness, but the antibodies that had defeated it. This survival was more than just a personal miracle. It was a transformative event. Where others saw only a capricious act of God, the experience planted a different seed in the mind of the young Giovanni. It fostered a burning, insatiable question. Why? Why had he lived when so many had died? What was this invisible enemy, and how could it be fought? His survival was not an end, but a beginning. The first crucial step on a path that would lead him from a victim of the plague to its most dedicated and brilliant adversary. Surviving the plague was not merely a physical trial for Giovanni. It was a psychological and intellectual crucible that fundamentally forged his worldview. While most of society, including the educated elite, interpreted the pandemic as an inscrutable act of divine wrath, a punishment for sin that could only be endured and appeased through prayer, Giovanni's first-hand encounter led him to a radically different conclusion. Lying in his sickbed, he had not felt the hand of God, but the ravages of a physical sickness, the fever, the pain, the palpable decay of the body. His survival was not a miracle of faith in his eyes, but a biological fact. Where his contemporaries saw a supernatural curse, the young Giovanni saw a complex, terrifying, but ultimately natural puzzle. This shift in perspective was monumental. It transformed the plague from a metaphysical phenomenon into a tangible enemy, a biological adversary that operated by rules which could, with careful study and observation, be understood. And if it could be understood, perhaps it could one day be predicted, contained, and even defeated. This core belief became the driving engine of his life. This newfound conviction propelled him on an unrelenting pursuit of knowledge. He immersed himself in the study of medicine, not as an abstract philosophy, but as a practical science of the human body. His intellectual journey took him to the prestigious University of Padua, the epicenter of anatomical and empirical science in Renaissance Europe. It was here, in the dissecting theaters, that his mindset was refined. He studied under renowned anatomists, learning to trust not the dusty dogma of ancient texts, but the evidence before his own eyes. His key traits, which would define his entire career, were honed to a razor's edge. He was meticulous, painstakingly detailed in his observations. He was profoundly observant, noting nuances and variations that others overlooked, and he was fiercely empirical, building his knowledge on a foundation of direct evidence and repeatable investigation. He began a prolific writing career, producing groundbreaking works on human anatomy, including a comprehensive study of the human skeleton where he bestowed the name ossa incutus, the anvil bones, upon the small bones of the ear, demonstrating his knack for precise, descriptive terminology. His reputation grew swiftly, leading him to a prestigious chair at the University of Naples and eventually catching the attention of the Spanish Viceroy of Sicily. It was this esteemed reputation that earned him the highest medical office in the land, the protomedico of the Kingdom of Sicily, a role that placed him in charge of all public health, medical licensing, and legal medicine. He was no longer just a scholar. He was a magistrate of medicine. For years, he applied his rigorous empirical mind to the myriad health challenges of the island, from regulating apothecaries to studying endemic diseases. He built a career, a reputation, and a life. Then the nightmare returned. In 1575, the very same year that marked the outbreak of his childhood sickness, the plague once again breached Palermo's walls. The same terror, the same sounds of mourning, the same stench of death descended upon the city. The ghost of his past had returned. But the man who faced this onslaught was profoundly different from the boy who had endured it decades before. Giovanni Filippo Ingrassia was no longer a helpless victim, a passive witness to the carnage. He was the protomedico, the city's chief health official. The memory of his own suffering, the collective trauma of his city, and a lifetime of scientific preparation had converged at this single critical moment. The puzzle that had consumed him since his youth was now laid out before him, not as a memory, but as a live epidemic threatening to consume his home. This time he would not simply endure it. He would fight back. As panic threatened to consume Palermo for the second time in his life, Ingrassia responded not with superstition, but with a strategy of breathtaking organization and empirical logic. While many still advocated for prayers, penitent processions, and seeking divine intervention as the primary remedies, Ingrassia saw a battle that had to be fought on the material plane. He understood that the enemy was not a vengeful spirit, but a contagion that spread through human contact and filth. His approach was a radical departure from the norm, replacing helplessness with a systematic, multi-front campaign. His first and most groundbreaking innovation was his sophisticated use of quarantine and isolation. The concept of quarantine itself was not entirely new, but Ingrassia refined it with a scientist's precision. He did not simply cast the sick into a single pestilential pit. Instead, he established a network of specialized isolation hospitals, known as lazarettos. He created separate facilities for different categories of individuals. One for those suspected of being exposed, another for those confirmed to have the plague, and a third for convalescents who were recovering but potentially still contagious. This prevented the sick from infecting the merely exposed, and the recovering from being reinfected, dramatically increasing the survival rate and slowing the chain of transmission in a way that had never been systematically attempted before. His decrees extended far beyond the hospital walls, reaching into the very fabric of city life. He issued a series of strict, comprehensive public health ordinances that read like a modern guide to epidemic control. He regulated waste disposal, understanding that the piles of filth in the streets were a breeding ground for disease. He controlled the prices of food and necessities to prevent profiteering during the crisis. He restricted public gatherings, including funerals and festivals, recognizing them as superspreader events. He even implemented a form of contact tracing, ordering the monitoring of households where the plague had appeared. Furthermore, Ingrassia was a meticulous data scientist before the field existed. He became a relentless recorder of facts, compiling detailed daily logs of new cases, symptoms presented, and final outcomes. This was not merely bookkeeping. It was active epidemiology. By tracking the disease's spread, he could identify hotspots, assess the effectiveness of his measures, and build a comprehensive picture of the outbreak's behavior. This data-driven approach allowed him to make informed decisions and allocate resources where they were most needed, a practice that stands as a cornerstone of modern public health. Amidst the chaos of fighting the plague, Ingrassia's brilliant powers of observation led him to a separate, and in some ways more lasting, scientific triumph. While examining the population, he began to notice a disease that, while often mistaken for measles or scarlet fever, presented with distinct and consistent differences. He recorded in meticulous detail an illness characterized by a mild fever and a distinctive rash of small rose-pink spots. Most notably, he observed the swelling of lymph nodes behind the ears and at the back of the neck, a key diagnostic feature. With remarkable clinical acumen, he systematically differentiated this disease from its more deadly cousins, providing the first clear medical description of what we now know as rubella, or German measles. This was a monumental contribution, born entirely from his empirical method. At a time when the very concept of a virus was centuries away, Ingrassia had successfully identified and catalogued a unique viral illness, isolating its clinical picture from the noise of other maladies. This work would stand for centuries as a foundational text in virology and pediatrics. The result of Ingrassia's comprehensive strategy was a testament to the power of rational science over blind fear. While the plague of 1575 was still a devastating event, his leadership and innovative measures undoubtedly saved countless lives in Palermo. More importantly, he created something durable, a blueprint. He demonstrated that an epidemic was not an unstoppable force of nature, but a public health crisis that could be managed, contained, and mitigated through organization, sanitation, data, and decisive action. He transformed public health from a concept into a practical administrative function. The boy who had survived the plague had grown into the architect who designed the defenses against it, leaving behind a legacy that would inform and inspire health responses for centuries to come, all the way to our modern era.